In 1953, a patient walked into a psychiatric ward complaining of hearing voices. 10 hours later, he walked out unable to speak, unable to remember his name, and barely able to feed himself. The doctor who treated him was employed by the CIA. The technique used was never written down, and the patient was never seen again. That experiment was real. It happened. And it's one of the tamer ones. Military science doesn't follow the same rules as civilian research. There are no ethics boards powerful enough to say no. No journalists allowed in the room, and when something goes wrong or too right, the entire project vanishes. Files are burned, witnesses reassigned, equipment dismantled and buried in unmarked warehouses. What remains are rumours, redacted documents, and the occasional whistleblower who dies under strange circumstances. These 10 experiments didn't fail because they were impossible. They were erased because they worked. The human hibernation chamber. In 1962, deep inside a naval research facility outside San Diego, a team of military physicians began testing a prototype that would later be dismissed as a fever dream. The device resembled an iron lung, but larger, more complex, with tubes running into refrigeration units and IV drips controlled by early computer systems. The goal was simple: to place a human being into a state of suspended animation for weeks, maybe months, without brain damage or organ failure. They called it induced hypothermic stasis. Soldiers called it the freezer. The science wasn't entirely new. Hypothermia had been studied for decades, particularly in cases of cold water drowning where victims survived longer than expected. But this was different. The military wanted controlled hibernation, a way to keep injured soldiers alive during long evacuations or to preserve personnel on extended submarine missions. Early tests on dogs showed promise. Canine subjects were cooled to near-fatal temperatures, held in stasis for up to 72 hours, then revived. Most survived, a few even seemed unaffected. Human trials began in 1963. Volunteers, though the term is questionable, were recruited from military prisons. Men facing court-martials were offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation. The first subject, a 23-year-old sailor convicted of desertion, was sedated and placed inside the chamber. His core temperature was gradually lowered using a network of cooling blankets and chilled saline infusions. Metabolic rates dropped. Brain activity slowed. After 16 hours, his body reached a state resembling death. No heartbeat on the monitor. Breathing undetectable. Yet tissue samples taken during the process showed cellular function continuing at a fraction of normal speed. He was held in that state for 9 days. When the warming process began, it took 30 hours to bring him back. He woke confused, disoriented, but alive. Cognitive tests showed no permanent damage. Motor skills returned within a week. The experiment was declared a success. Then things got strange. 3 weeks after his revival, the sailor began experiencing vivid, intrusive memories that weren't his. He described events from the 1940s, places he'd never been, people he'd never met. Psychiatric evaluations suggested dissociative episodes, possibly trauma-induced, but other test subjects reported similar phenomena. One claimed to have experienced time as non-linear, seeing his past and future simultaneously during stasis. Another said he felt the presence of others in the void, though he'd been alone in the chamber. The program was quietly shelved in 1965. Official reports cited technical limitations and ethical concerns, but a declassified memo from 1968, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request decades later, mentioned discontinuation due to unforeseen psychological contamination. The memo never explained what that meant. The chamber itself was dismantled. Blueprints were classified under a designation that still bars their release. Former personnel who worked on the project have refused interviews, and 2 who agreed to speak off the record died within months of each other in the 1990s. Natural causes both times. What remains is a question that gnaws at researchers who've studied the fragments. If the technology worked, why wasn't it developed further? Modern medicine now uses therapeutic hypothermia in trauma care, but nothing close to the multi-day stasis achieved in those tests. Either the military abandoned a functional life-saving technology for no reason, Or something happened inside that chamber that made continuation impossible. The telepathic transmission experiment. In 1959, at a research annex buried beneath Fort Meade, a psychologist named Dr. Edwin Harrow proposed an experiment so controversial that even the Pentagon hesitated. He wanted to test whether human consciousness could transmit information across distance without physical means, not through radio signals or coded messages, but through thought alone. He called it non-local cognition. The military called it Project Whisper. The setup was deceptively simple. 2 subjects isolated in separate soundproof rooms 100 feet apart. One designated as the sender, the other the receiver. The sender would be shown a series of images, geometric shapes, playing cards, photographs, and instructed to focus intensely on transmitting the image mentally. The receiver, equipped with nothing but a notepad, would attempt to draw or describe what they perceived. Standard ESP testing, the kind that had been performed in university labs for years with unremarkable results. But Harrow added a variable no civilian researcher had access to: electromagnetic field manipulation. Both rooms were surrounded by Faraday cages, eliminating external interference. Then, using modified radar equipment, he introduced low-frequency electromagnetic pulses into the sender's chamber, synchronized to the subject's brainwave patterns. The hypothesis was that thoughts might be carried on measurable frequencies, and amplifying those frequencies could extend their range. Initial trials showed chance-level results: 50 correct guesses out of 200 attempts. Statistically meaningless. Then during the 7th session, something shifted. The receiver, a 29-year-old Army specialist, suddenly stopped drawing. He stared at his blank page for 30 seconds, then wrote a single sentence. "He's thinking about his daughter drowning." The sender in the adjacent chamber had not been shown an image. He'd been left alone and, unbeknownst to the researchers, had drifted into a memory of a recurring nightmare about his child's death. A nightmare he'd never discussed with anyone. The session was halted. But in subsequent tests, accuracy spiked. Not with the assigned images, but with unguarded thoughts, emotions, and memories. Receivers began reporting intrusive flashes of the sender's internal state. One described tasting cigarettes, though he'd never smoked. The sender was a chain smoker. Another experienced a sudden flood of grief and saw a woman's face she didn't recognize. The sender had been thinking about his recently deceased mother. What disturbed the research team most was the reverse effect. Senders began reporting that they could feel the receiver's presence, as though someone was inside their head, watching. One sender refused to continue, claiming he heard the receiver's voice in his mind, even though no words had been spoken. Psychological evaluations suggested folie à deux, shared delusion between participants. But the phenomenon occurred across multiple pairs who had never met. By 1961, the project had shifted focus entirely. Researchers were no longer trying to send images. They were trying to understand what channel had been opened and whether it could be closed. Subjects reported persistent effects weeks after participation. Intrusive thoughts that felt foreign, sudden emotional shifts with no clear cause, and in 2 cases, knowledge of events they shouldn't have known. One former receiver described a conversation in detail that had occurred in a locked room he'd never entered. The program was terminated in 1962. The official reason given was inconclusive results. But a declassified Army intelligence report from 1975 referenced Project Whisper as discontinued due to operational security risks. If operatives could unintentionally transmit classified information through unshielded thought, the implications were catastrophic. The equipment was destroyed. Participants were debriefed, then reassigned to distant posts with no mutual contact. Dr. Harrow continued his career in military psychology, but never published on the subject again. He died in 1983. His personal research notes were never found. The question that lingers isn't whether telepathy is real, it's whether the military accidentally proved it was, then realised they'd opened a door they couldn't control. The Pain Erasure Protocol. In 1968, at a classified medical facility within Walter Reed Army Medical Center, A neurosurgeon named Dr. Vincent Cross began work on what he described as the final solution to battlefield trauma. Not a painkiller, not anesthesia, but a procedure that could permanently sever the brain's ability to process physical pain while leaving all other sensations intact. The patient would feel pressure, temperature, touch, but never suffering. He called it selective neural ablation. Internal memos referred to it as Project Mercy. The technique involved targeted micro-lesions in specific regions of the brain's pain matrix, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, and parts of the thalamus. Using a stereotactic frame and early ultrasound imaging, Cross could destroy clusters of neurons with near-surgical precision. The theory was sound. Patients with certain brain injuries had been documented living without pain perception, and while they faced risks, unnoticed infections, injuries ignored, they functioned normally in every other capacity. Human trials began with terminal patients who volunteered, men with inoperable cancers who'd exhausted all other options. The first subject underwent the procedure in October 1968. Recovery took 2 weeks. When asked to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10, he stared blankly and said he didn't understand the question. His cancer was still there, the tissue damage remained, but the suffering had vanished. He described it as the absence of weight, as though something oppressive had been lifted, but he couldn't remember what it felt like to carry it. The military saw potential, soldiers who could fight through injuries without debilitation, operatives who couldn't be broken by torture. But within months, the patients began to change. Not physically, but in ways harder to quantify. They stopped responding to emotional pain as well. Grief became distant. Fear disappeared. One patient, informed of his wife's death, acknowledged the information without visible reaction. Another, shown photographs of his children, recognized them but felt nothing. Cross noted in his records that the procedure seemed to have disrupted more than nociception. It had dulled the entire affective spectrum. Then came the suicides. 3 patients within 6 months. No notes, no clear motive. Psychological evaluations prior to their deaths showed flat affect, but no depression, no expressed intent. It was as though they'd made a calm, rational decision that life without pain, physical or emotional, wasn't worth continuing. Cross theorized that pain, even suffering, provided a crucial anchor to embodied existence. Remove it entirely and the mind drifts unmoored. The program ended in 1970. Official records state that the procedure was deemed too imprecise and carried unacceptable psychological risks. But a partially redacted document from the Church Committee hearings in 1977 referenced Project Mercy as an example of research terminated due to profound ethical violations. The nature of those violations was never elaborated. Cross continued working in military neuroscience until his retirement in 1984, but he never published findings from the trial. When asked about it years later by a journalist, he responded simply, "Some doors shouldn't be opened." Decades later, modern pain research has circled back to similar concepts. Deep brain stimulation, nerve blocks, even experimental gene therapies aimed at silencing pain receptors. But none approached the totality of what Cross achieved. Perhaps because the cost was too high, or perhaps because someone decided that a human being incapable of suffering is no longer entirely human. What these 3 experiments share is a pattern. They worked. They produced results that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of their time, and then, without fanfare or explanation, they were erased. But these were only the beginning. The resonance chamber. In 1952, deep within a converted warehouse outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, physicist Harold Trent constructed what his notes described as a standing wave containment field. The device consisted of precisely arranged steel panels forming an octagonal chamber with electromagnetic coils positioned at mathematically calculated intervals along the walls. When activated, these coils generated overlapping frequency patterns that created what Trent called a null space, a zone where electromagnetic interference theoretically cancelled itself out. The military funded the project under the assumption it would produce a stealth chamber, a space invisible to radar. But Trent discovered something else entirely. Objects placed inside the chamber during activation began exhibiting temporal anomalies. A mechanical clock, synchronized to the second with an identical unit outside, lost exactly 14 minutes over a 6-hour test period. Not gradually. The discrepancy appeared all at once when the field collapsed. Trent repeated the experiment with digital counters, biological samples, even a caged rat. Every test showed the same effect. Time inside the chamber moved differently. The rat emerged disoriented but physically unchanged. Blood work revealed elevated cortisol but no other abnormalities. Trent theorized the field wasn't stopping time but creating a localized distortion in how electromagnetic processes unfolded, essentially slowing the propagation of causality itself within the bounded space. He drafted plans for a human trial. Before approval came through, the warehouse burned. Investigators found accelerant residue, but no suspects. Trent's notes, stored in a fireproof safe, were confiscated by military police and classified. He was reassigned to conventional radar research and died in 1971 without publishing a word about the chamber. Years later, a researcher digging through declassified Air Force documents found a single reference. Project Echo Temporal Displacement Study, terminated due to causality paradox concerns. No elaboration, no follow-up, just a line item and a date that matched Trent's fire. If the chamber worked as described, the implications were staggering. Not time travel in the science fiction sense, but something perhaps more unsettling. A pocket of reality operating on a different clock. A place where minutes could be borrowed or lost, where cause and effect became negotiable. And if it was destroyed, someone had decided that negotiation was too dangerous to allow. The cellular reversal protocol. In 1979, a team at a private research facility in Lausanne, Switzerland, announced they had successfully reversed senescence in mammalian tissue samples. Lead researcher Dr. Emily Fournier described the process as chronological unwinding, using a combination of targeted radiation, chemical catalysts, and electromagnetic stimulation to trigger cellular regeneration beyond normal repair mechanisms. Tissue samples from elderly mice, when subjected to the protocol, didn't just heal, they de-aged. Cells exhibited markers consistent with younger specimens. Collagen structures reformed. Mitochondrial function improved. Under microscopic analysis, the tissue appeared biologically younger by every measurable standard. The breakthrough wasn't immortality. It was localized age reversal, the ability to turn back cellular clocks in specific areas. Fournier proposed applications for degenerative diseases, organ repair, wound healing in elderly patients. The initial paper, submitted to The Lancet, passed peer review and was scheduled for publication. Then it wasn't. The journal issued a retraction before publication, citing irregularities in experimental data. Fournier protested, providing raw datasets and offering to replicate the results under independent observation. No institution accepted. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, where she held her position, declined to renew her contract. Funding evaporated overnight. 2 years later, a pharmaceutical conglomerate filed patents for a cellular regeneration therapy, using methods nearly identical to Fournier's published abstracts. When confronted, they claimed independent development. The patents were approved. The therapy never reached market. Instead, the company licensed the intellectual property to a defense contractor specializing in biomedical research for military applications. Fournier spent the remainder of her career teaching undergraduate biology. In a 1998 interview buried in an obscure French medical journal, she stated, "I proved we could reverse aging at the cellular level. They didn't suppress it because it didn't work. They suppressed it because it worked too well, and in the wrong hands it would have destroyed entire economic structures dependent on aging and death." She died in 2004. Her original research materials were donated to a university archive, where they remain sealed pending estate resolution, a process now entering its third decade. The neural silence generator. By 1985, advances in neuroscience had mapped enough of the brain's electrical activity to attempt something previously unthinkable: targeted thought suppression, not through surgery or drugs, but through external electromagnetic interference. Researcher Dr. Anton Weiss, working at a laboratory in East Berlin, developed a device he called the cognitive damper. It resembled a modified EEG cap, but instead of reading brainwaves, it emitted them. The device generated counterphase signals matched precisely to the subject's neural oscillations, effectively cancelling specific frequencies associated with conscious thought processes. When active, subjects reported an eerie stillness, not unconsciousness, but the absence of internal dialogue. No racing thoughts, no intrusive memories, just presence. Early tests produced remarkable results. Subjects with severe anxiety disorders experienced immediate relief. Those with PTSD reported the cessation of flashbacks during treatment. One participant described it as finally being alone inside my own head, but extended exposure revealed problems. After repeated sessions, subjects began exhibiting what Weiss termed cognitive flattening. Their ability to generate spontaneous thoughts diminished. Creativity dropped. Problem-solving skills deteriorated. One subject, a mathematician, found himself unable to perform calculations he'd done effortlessly for years. The suppression was bleeding over, dampening not just unwanted thoughts, but cognition itself. Weiss suspected the brain was adapting, compensating for the interference by reducing overall activity. He halted human trials and began drafting safety protocols, but before he could publish, the Berlin Wall fell. In the chaos of reunification, the laboratory was ransacked. Equipment vanished, files were scattered or destroyed. Weiss himself was briefly detained by Western intelligence, questioned about his work, then released without explanation. He resurfaced in 1993 teaching at a small university in Austria, but never resumed the research. When asked why, he gave a cryptic response: because silence, once learned, becomes addictive, and an addicted mind stops being a mind at all. Rumours circulated in the late 90s that military psychological operations units had acquired similar technology. Soldiers in classified units reportedly used neural stabilizers during high-stress deployments, devices that supposedly enhanced focus by dampening fear responses. No official documentation exists. The soldiers who mentioned them later recanted, claiming they'd been joking or misunderstood. But one detail persists across multiple accounts. The devices worked by making users feel nothing. No fear, no doubt, just action. And when removed, some users struggled to feel anything again. The gravity lens. In 1963, an aerospace engineer named Victor Chen proposed an idea so radical that NASA initially rejected it as theoretical fantasy. Chen believed that by manipulating localized gravitational fields using precisely calibrated rotating masses and electromagnetic fields, one could create a lens that bent space-time enough to magnify or distort gravitational pull in a controlled area. He wasn't talking about anti-gravity. He was talking about gravity manipulation, the ability to increase or decrease gravitational force within a bounded region. His early calculations, reviewed by physicists at MIT, were sound in principle but required energy levels far beyond available technology. Except Chen found a workaround. Using superconducting materials and a rotating toroidal chamber, he constructed a small-scale prototype in a private lab, funded by an anonymous investor. The device was no larger than a washing machine. When activated, objects placed inside experienced measurable changes in weight. A 5-pound mass registered as 7 pounds under increased field strength, or 3 pounds under decreased strength, all without changing the object's actual mass. Independent verification was conducted by 2 physicists from Caltech. Both signed affidavits confirming the effect. Both later claimed they'd been mistaken, that the measurements were artifacts of electromagnetic interference. Neither would discuss the matter further. Chen attempted to publish. Journals rejected the work as insufficiently substantiated, despite the verified data. He sought additional funding to scale up the device. Every application was denied. Then his investor pulled out, citing unforeseen circumstances. Within months, Chen's lab was burglarized. The prototype was taken. Nothing else. Security footage showed 2 individuals in unmarked coveralls systematically dismantling and removing the device. Police filed a report. No investigation followed. Chen rebuilt from memory, but the second prototype never functioned correctly. He suspected critical calibration data had been altered in his notes during the burglary, subtle changes that rendered the design inert. He spent the next decade trying to recover the exact specifications. He never did. In 1981, a research paper from a Soviet laboratory described a gravitational modulation experiment using methods nearly identical to Chen's original design. The paper appeared in a single issue of an obscure physics journal, then vanished. Attempts to locate the authors or the laboratory yielded nothing. So, if Chen's device worked, it meant gravity, the one force considered untouchable, immutable, could be controlled. Satellites could hover without fuel, buildings could stand without foundations, weapons could crush targets from a distance without a trace. Or perhaps someone simply decided that power over gravity was power no one should have. The magnetic healing chamber. In 1987, in a converted warehouse outside Budapest, Hungary, a team of biomedical researchers constructed a sealed chamber lined entirely with copper mesh and powered by an array of precisely tuned electromagnetic coils. The project, funded through a series of anonymous grants, aimed to test a controversial hypothesis: that specific magnetic field frequencies could accelerate cellular regeneration and healing. Patients with chronic wounds, bone fractures, and degenerative tissue damage were invited to participate. Each session lasted 30 minutes. The results defied conventional medical understanding. One participant, a factory worker with a non-healing leg ulcer that had resisted treatment for 18 months, entered the chamber twice weekly for a month. By week 3, the wound had closed completely. Medical examiners found no scarring, only healthy tissue where necrotic flesh had been. Another subject, an elderly woman with severe osteoporosis, showed measurable bone density increases after 6 sessions. Her physician, initially skeptical, submitted the scans to 3 independent radiologists. All confirmed the findings. None could explain them. The chamber operated using what the team called harmonic resonance therapy, a method that synchronized electromagnetic pulses with the body's natural cellular frequencies. The system didn't heat tissue or stimulate nerves through conventional means. Instead, it appeared to create an environment where damaged cells reorganized themselves more efficiently. Blood tests showed temporary spikes in ATP production and decreased inflammatory markers during and immediately after exposure. The effects persisted for days. Word spread quietly through medical circles. Doctors began referring patients who had exhausted all other options. Success rates hovered near 80% for conditions ranging from fractures to chronic pain. Then, a journalist published a feature article in a national health magazine. Within weeks, the facility received hundreds of inquiries, applications for treatment poured in. The team prepared to expand. That's when everything stopped. A regulatory agency appeared, citing concerns about unlicensed medical devices. The chamber was shut down pending review. Equipment was seized for safety testing. The lead researcher was summoned for questioning about undisclosed electromagnetic exposure levels. No violations were found, but the process dragged on for months. Funding dried up, team members scattered to other projects. The warehouse was eventually sold. Years later, one of the original engineers revealed in a private letter that the chamber's specifications had been quietly acquired by a pharmaceutical consortium during the regulatory investigation. The designs were never returned. Attempts to rebuild using remembered parameters failed. Key details involving coil spacing and frequency modulation were missing. The engineer suspected the confiscated blueprints had been altered before being archived, rendering replication impossible. If the chamber truly worked, it represented something far more disruptive than a new treatment. It suggested that healing could be accelerated without drugs, without surgery, without the infrastructure that sustains modern medicine. A therapy that required only electricity and precise engineering threatened entire supply chains built on chronic illness and repeat prescriptions. Perhaps that's why it disappeared before it could spread. The memory injection. In 1999, neuroscientists at a private research institute in Vienna announced they had successfully transferred learned behaviors between rats using nothing but extracted neural proteins. The experiment involved training one rat to navigate a complex maze, then isolating specific proteins from its hippocampus and injecting them into an untrained rat. The second rat navigated the maze on its first attempt with near-perfect accuracy, despite never having seen it before. The implications were staggering. Memory, it seemed, could be chemically encoded and physically transferred. The team moved quickly to explore whether the process could work with more complex information. They trained rats to associate specific sounds with rewards, then transferred those associations to naive subjects. Again, success. The receiving rats responded appropriately without prior conditioning. The protein extracts appeared to carry not just raw data, but learned context and behavioral responses. The mechanism wasn't fully understood, but the effect was undeniable. Human trials were proposed but never approved. Ethical review boards raised concerns about consent, identity, and unintended psychological effects. But internal documents suggest another reason for hesitation: the technology's potential for misuse. A memo from the Institute's Ethics Committee warned that memory transfer could enable non-consensual skill acquisition, implanted false experiences, or weaponized trauma induction. The project was classified as high risk and placed under restricted access protocols. Funding continued in secret for another 3 years. During that time, the team reportedly refined the extraction process, identifying which neural proteins carried specific types of memories, motor skills versus emotional experiences versus factual knowledge. One researcher's notes describe successful transfer of a trained piano sequence from one volunteer to another, though no formal study was published. Another entry mentions unexpected retention of source identity markers, suggesting recipients experience fragments of the donor's sense of self alongside the transferred memories. In 2003, the Institute abruptly closed its neuroscience division. Staff were reassigned or dismissed. All research materials were transferred to an undisclosed location for archival preservation. Requests for access have been consistently denied. One former team member, speaking anonymously years later, claimed the program didn't end. It moved. Contracts were signed with a defense contractor shortly before the closure. The researcher suspected the work continued under military oversight, exploring applications in rapid skill training for operatives or enhanced interrogation methods. If memory can be extracted and transplanted, then the boundaries of individual identity become negotiable. Knowledge could be distributed like software. Experiences could be copied, edited, or erased. The self would no longer be a private, inviolable domain. Someone decided that frontier was too dangerous to explore openly. But the question remains, did the research truly stop? Or did it simply go somewhere we're not allowed to see? The bone regeneration compound. In 2005, a biochemist working at a university hospital in Oslo, Norway, synthesized a compound that seemed to defy everything known about bone healing. Standard medical treatment for severe fractures involves weeks or months of immobilization, with bones healing slowly through natural cellular processes. This compound, derived from a modified form of calcium phosphate combined with a rare peptide sequence, accelerated the process to days. Fractures that should have taken 8 weeks to heal closed completely in 12 days. Initial tests used animal models, rabbits with surgically induced fractures. Post-treatment X-rays showed not just healed bone, but bone structurally identical to the original, with no loss of density or strength. The compound wasn't merely filling gaps. It was guiding cellular reconstruction at an accelerated rate, while maintaining perfect fidelity to the original structure. Human trials followed with informed consent from patients facing long recovery periods. Results mirrored the animal studies. One patient with a shattered femur walked unassisted within 3 weeks. The compound worked by triggering a cascade of osteoblast activity, the cells responsible for bone formation, while simultaneously suppressing osteoclast activity, which breaks down bone tissue. But it did so in a targeted, self-limiting way. Once the fracture healed, the compound became inert and was absorbed harmlessly by the body. No side effects were reported, no complications arose. It was, by all measures, a perfect solution to a common medical problem. Then the hospital's ethics board raised concerns, not about safety but about access. If the compound reached market, it would render entire orthopedic treatment protocols obsolete. Physical therapy programs, extended hospital stays, follow-up imaging, pain management regimens, all would be drastically reduced or eliminated. One board member reportedly argued that such a dramatic shift would destabilize healthcare economics before infrastructure could adapt. The biochemist was encouraged to slow down, publish incrementally, conduct more trials, extend the research timeline. She refused and sought external partnerships to bring the compound to production. Pharmaceutical companies expressed interest, then withdrew without explanation. Patent applications stalled in review. Regulatory agencies requested additional data that had already been provided. The process became circular, bureaucratic, and ultimately immovable. Frustrated, the biochemist attempted to share her findings through open-source medical journals. Her submissions were rejected for insufficient peer review, despite multiple co-authors and verified clinical data. She presented at conferences, but her sessions were poorly attended and never recorded. Gradually, her work faded from academic discussion. She left research in 2009 and now works in private practice, declining all interviews about the compound. If a broken bone could heal in days instead of months, the entire framework of orthopedic medicine would shift. Recovery times would plummet, insurance models would collapse, revenue streams built on extended care would vanish. The compound didn't fail, it succeeded too well, and in doing so, it became a problem that couldn't be solved. Only buried. The silent field generator. In 2011, an acoustics engineer in Melbourne, Australia, developed a device that could create zones of absolute silence within a defined radius. Not noise cancellation, which works by generating inverse sound waves, but true acoustic nullification, a field where sound waves cease to propagate entirely. The generator used a combination of ultrasonic emitters and phase-cancelling resonators arranged in a spherical array. When activated, the space inside became a void where even a shout produced no audible sound. Demonstrations were conducted in controlled environments. Observers standing outside the field could see people inside speaking, moving, even striking objects together, but heard nothing. The effect was complete and unsettling. One journalist described it as stepping into a sensory vacuum where even the background hum of existence disappeared. The technology had obvious applications: secure communication, covert operations, industrial noise control, even therapeutic environments for sensory processing disorders. Military interest arrived immediately. Defense contractors offered substantial sums for exclusive licensing. But the engineer hesitated. He'd built the device for research, not weaponization. He understood its potential for misuse: interrogation chambers, crowd suppression, isolation torture. He refused the offers and attempted to release the design publicly, hoping open access would prevent monopolization. Before he could publish, his lab was broken into. The prototype was destroyed, backup drives were wiped, cloud storage accounts were deleted. He reported the incident, but the investigation went nowhere. He tried rebuilding from memory but found his detailed notes had been corrupted. Files replaced with random data, timestamps altered, critical measurements overwritten. Now the technology exists only in fragments, a concept without a complete blueprint, a memory of silence that can't be reproduced. If the field generator truly worked, someone made sure it would never work again. And in its absence, we're left wondering what else has been built, tested, and then erased before the world could decide what to do with it. These experiments share a common thread that's impossible to ignore. They weren't abandoned because they failed. They were erased because they succeeded in ways that made them dangerous, not to human safety, but to existing power structures. A healing chamber that eliminates the need for chronic medication. A bone compound that cuts recovery time by 90%, a memory transfer process that could revolutionize education or warfare. Each one threatened to redistribute power, collapse markets, or expose uncomfortable truths about what's possible when research isn't filtered through profit motives. The pattern is always the same: initial success, growing interest, then sudden intervention, regulatory obstacles, funding withdrawal, mysterious accidents, or outright confiscation. The technology vanishes and the researchers either go silent or disappear entirely. What remains are fragments, rumours, and the occasional declassified document with entire sections redacted. The military didn't erase these experiments to protect us from dangerous technology. They erased them to protect the systems that depend on scarcity, limitation, and control. Because a world where bones heal in days, where silence can be weaponized or liberated, where memory itself becomes transferable, that world doesn't need the infrastructure we've built. It doesn't need the same hospitals, the same weapons, the same hierarchies. These 10 cases are likely just the visible edge of something much larger. For every experiment documented here, how many others were buried so thoroughly that not even rumours survived? The real question isn't what was possible in these labs. It's what's possible right now in facilities we'll never hear about, using discoveries that will never be shared. The future keeps arriving in secret, and someone keeps deciding we're not ready for it.